Good evening, everyone. Thankful for you tuning in, being a part of our study today. And we've been pretty much doing these studies every day since we went through the quarantine issue, and very pleased with what we've been able to accomplish in our time of separation. Thankful for you and for your willingness to be a part of what we're doing, and hope that it's been beneficial to you. Hope that you have been able to take some of the things that we've been studying and use them in your everyday life. And we certainly look forward to the time when we can all be together and study once more as a group. So tonight, as we get started, we want to focus on our third through sixth graders for just a moment. And we've been asking you about several different things. What do you know about this? What do you know about this? And tonight, we want you to think about what three things can you come up with? What three things can you think about the story of Jacob and Esau? What do you know about Jacob and Esau? So share that with your parents, share that with grandparents, whoever it is that you're close to. And mom and dad, you guys continue to do a good job, as I know many of you have, with trying to get your kids to focus, at least for a little while, on something other than TV or being outside or whatever, as we try to spend a little bit of time in a devotional type setting. This is Daily Devotional number 34. We are still centered on this topic of Christian evidence, and we certainly want to continue that discussion. We've talked at length about how important this is. We've explained it this way, that why is it important to study the existence of God? Because God is a being greater than anything that can be imagined or thought of, and God is foundational in the order of simply being. And so it is very important that we understand who He is, what He represents, and why we can take confidence in any discussion we may have with someone concerning why we believe what we believe. Again, going back to sort of our theme verse for this study, which has been 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15, the idea of giving a reason for the hope that is within us. There are some objections to this question. I wanted to kind of take just a brief moment and sort of lay out for you what it is that somebody might say to you as far as reasons why this particular discussion is necessary. They might look at you and they might say, look, bottom line, we can't know God exists because we can't know anything. This has become a more popular argument in the last, I would say, maybe couple of decades. As we've become much more of a postmodern society, we've become much more of an anti-absolutism society. We've become much more focused on loopholes and exceptions rather than facts. And you see this, unfortunately, it's sad, but we see this a lot even in what should be reported as news is oftentimes politicized, or it's taken and it's made into a sort of a comedy show because it truthfully is aimed and geared at a particular audience, and it's worded in certain ways to make them happy, and therefore the facts get sort of pushed out of the way and ignored. I believe it was Mark Twain that said, never let the facts get in the way of a good story. And unfortunately, that is the way that our society operates. And so when someone comes to you and maybe perhaps they have questions about the existence of God, one of the things that may be sticking sort of in their brain is, but what about this idea that we can't truly know anything, therefore we can't know God exists? Well, let me say it this way, and I certainly don't mean to come off in any sort of smug way here, but the fact that someone tells you that we cannot know anything sort of refutes their own argument. You see, the argument of anti-absolutism is sort of, it sort of defeats itself. It doesn't really need us to defeat it, because the idea of making a statement like, we cannot know anything, well, they are making a statement of absolute. They're making a statement that is absolute in its nature. We cannot know anything. Well, you've already defeated your argument then, because the truth of the matter is, if you make a statement, we cannot know anything, then that must mean we can know something. And so here's the idea behind this particular objection. it's really not coming from the I know for a fact that we can't know anything. Where it's coming from is people a lot of times feel like nothing can be for certain, that there's nothing that is 100% right all the time. And that's where we struggle with our human brain, because we know that in life, it seems like nothing is ever for certain. However, there are ways that we can look around in our world today, and we can look around at life itself, and we can know some things absolutely for certain. For instance, in the realm of math, we know for a fact that 2 plus 2 equals 4. That's true 100% of the time. There's never going to be a moment where if I take two things and I add two more, I do not wind up with 4. So I know that the statement sort of is a statement that gets attention in saying we cannot know God exists because we cannot know anything for certain. Well, that's really not true. There are a lot of things that we accept and we know fully. So it's just not factual to state that we cannot know anything. Number two objection that you might get: we cannot know God exists because our faith makes a knowledge of God impossible. This one's a little more in depth, and it takes the idea of faith and sort of turns it into a negative. Someone might say, well, you cannot know for certain that God exists because it takes faith for you to even have a knowledge of God. So therefore, if it's faith, then that means there's no evidence, there's no background, there's no proof, and therefore the idea of knowing God is there. That's just impossible. Here is where you have to understand that we while there are a lot of things in our life that we know, there are a lot of things that we operate by faith in. Even if we remove this from the religious discussion, when I pull up at a stop sign and it's a four-way stop, which I know nobody knows how to operate anymore, but if you pull up to a four-way stop and it's my turn to go and I ease out into that intersection, or I go to make my turn, I have faith that no one else in that four-way stop is going to gun it and hit me in the side of my vehicle. When the light turns red at a particular stoplight, I have faith that everyone else is going to stop if it's my turn and it's turning green for me. I mean, there are many other ways. We could take this so many other ways. We go to the doctor, and we have faith that that doctor is going to prescribe a medicine for us that's going to help us with whatever our condition is. There's so many things in our life that we just have faith in. Even something as simple as when you flip the switch of your light panel at home, you assume that the lights in your home are going to come on. You have faith that that's going to work. You don't go there and think, well, I hope, I'm not sure. Maybe it's a 50-50 if the lights are going to come on. You have faith and you know flipping that switch, it's going to come on. So that ultimately the idea of faith being a negative and saying that because you have to have faith and that makes something impossible, we're not going to, we understand that's not a plausible argument. It's one that people are going to make, but it's one that you can talk through with them. Number three, people might say we cannot know God exists because he cannot be known by the senses. This one you're going to have maybe some difficulty with. I know that I do, because I believe that I can experience God through all of my senses. I believe that he does speak to me through his word, through the word of God, so I can hear him when I hear the words of God. I can see him when I wake up in the morning and I see a sunrise, or I see all manner of things. I can taste that in the sense that I can eat the foods that have been provided in this world for me to take part of, and know that God gave us the ability to have those things, and so on and so forth. We can continue to go all the way down the list of senses, and we can say that we experience those things. However, the reason why I say this is a difficult thing to discuss a lot of times with people is because if they already are doubting that God exists, it's going to be difficult for you to simply look at them and say, well, I can see this, or I can hear this, or you're going to have to go into more detail with them. I hope that we're able to do that later on in one of these studies, is kind of give you some actual real life examples of some things. I was so fortunate at Mars Hill Bible School to have Dr. Kenny Barfield teach an evidences class there. And I was just looking even before I began tonight at the notebooks that I had for my class. This was back in 2000. And so 20 years ago, I had that class, and I still have my notebooks with all my information in it. And I was just amazed at so many different examples that he gave to us, that he showed us, that he gave us proof of God's existence. So hopefully down the road we'll be able to share those with you, and that will help answer this number 3. You can actually give some very real life examples. And then number 4, we've already sort of discussed this, which is we cannot know God exists because man's nature is so corrupt. We actually even discussed it last night in our time together. The idea of the need for man to be governed, or the need for man to be have some rules and regulations. That does not disprove God's existence. Sin is sin, regardless of whether or not you believe in God and you believe in His existence. To murder someone, we understand it's wrong. We understand that it is a bad thing. It's terrible. We get that. But we also know that there are people who do those things who have remorse. Well, if man's nature is so corrupt that then there could obviously not be a God in existence, then where in the world do we get the conscience from? And we'll talk about that more also in just a moment. Now, I just want to do this very quickly at the end here, and just some broad overview. I mean, this is painting with an extremely broad brush concerning the proof of God's existence. There's 3 kind of major areas that we want to look at very briefly, and certainly we're going to come back to these things because there's no way that I can cover in one devotional even one of these things. So we will try to come back to these things as we go, but I just wanted to give you sort of a brief, broad overview. There are, first and foremost, there are proofs based on the existence and nature of the world. First and foremost, there's the cosmological proof. These proofs are based on the very general characteristics of the world. Something like contingency, the idea of something relying on something else, or something being left to chance. Some might say the cosmological argument is an argument in which the existence of a unique being is deduced or inferred from facts or alleged facts concerning causation, change, motion, contingency, in respect of the universe as a whole or processes within it. So the idea of contingency, the idea of causation, cause and effect, which we talked about in our discussion Sunday night, all of these things play into the idea of the cosmological proof. And again, this is just a very broad overview. The teleological proofs that we see are based on certain particular characteristics of the world. So for instance, this might be where you would get into the order argument, or the order of things. The word teleos or telos means purpose or goal. So that's where the idea of the teleological argument. The idea is that it takes a purposer or a designer to have purpose. So where we see things obviously intended for a purpose, we can assume those things were made for a reason. In other words, to put this in terms perhaps that you've heard many times before, a design implies a designer. So you see things like the difference between the Grand Canyon and Mount Rushmore. One is designed clearly, one is not. The Grand Canyon was clearly formed by natural processes, whereas Mount Rushmore was designed. So we would look at that and we would say, okay, for Mount Rushmore to be there, that meant that someone had to design that and execute it. And therefore, when we look at the world, we say there's no way this could be left to chance. There is an order to things. There is a process by which these things happen. Therefore, there had to be some kind of a designer out there to do that. Okay, so again, very broad overview. There's secondarily, second group of proofs are based on the meaning between God and man, the ordination to God, the natural desire. God has sort of an order to things, that they fall in order. We spoke briefly about this, the idea of a plant having seeds contained within it so that it can reproduce after its own kind. Animals the same way, even humanity the same way. There's an order to God's plan, and there's a natural desire, there's a natural flow to things. And we know we could get into a long discussion about things that are unnatural within those type of movements, but at the same time we get the idea of order. Even those who don't believe in God understand the need for falling in line and falling inside. They understand order. They get things that are purposed and things that are placed in a particular order. Again, look at something as simple as a recipe for a particular dish or a particular food. We understand that if we operate in accordance to that recipe, we are going to get the natural desired result. Whereas if we step outside of that recipe and we begin to sort of free will it, as it were, then you might not achieve the thing that you were going for in the first place. You certainly will not achieve it as it is designed. So there's some discussion there, and then also what we briefly touched on just a moment ago, the idea of morality. If there was no God, if there was no divine being that set forth all this in motion, then where in the world did we come up with the idea of a conscience? Where does each man and each woman where does their conscience come from? Do you just magically get that? And we talked about that also. And then finally, the third sort of group here would be proofs based on the notion of God. The ontological argument for God is one of the few arguments originating in logic rather than observation. Teleological and cosmological arguments, for instance, demonstrate how the existence of God best explains apparent design in nature and the nature of causality, respectively. In contrast, the ontological argument relies on pure reasoning. The argument has strengths and weaknesses. It's not really one that is used, I would say, for the 100% convincing rate, but it leads to ideas that strongly support the existence of God. So it is very, very important. The idea of the ontological, and again, I'm going to give you just the very brief, basic. It would be sort of the idea that there is reason to believe a supreme being is out there. For instance, one way to sort of look at this is if there is an absolute measure of goodness, then, and English teachers beware, the quote, most good, end quote, thing must exist. The same would be true of power. If there is an absolute measure of power, if there's an absolute measure of knowledge, then there must be the most powerful or the most knowledgeable thing out there. And so there must be something in existence than which no greater or more perfect thing can be conceived. And so it's a logical argument in the sense that if this, then that. It's sort of a, if this is true, then this is true, then this, it sort of builds upon itself. And ultimately you have to arrive at something that is the most perfect, the absolute perfect. Well, we know that that cannot be found in humanity. Therefore, we'd have to look outside of normal everyday humanity. We can't see it in nature, so we'd have to look to the supernatural. And therein sort of is the brief, broad overview of the ontological argument. We are certainly going to try to spend more time in these areas. We just may not necessarily call them this as we discuss them, but I wanted just to put them in your toolbox because I think you need to spend some time, and I would encourage you and give you some homework here to go and do some research on these three arguments. There's plenty of documentation through the Apologetics Press website. There's also a group called the Daily Apologist that I would encourage you to go look them up. They're on Facebook. Also, you can go, I believe they have a website as well, but the Daily Apologist, Apologist, and then certainly Apologetics Press, great places to find a lot of information. But what we were trying to do in today's daily devotional is simply show you really that there are going to be some of these objections here to the question of God's existence. And we just wanted to make sure we're giving ourselves at least a fair fighting chance when someone wants to have this conversation. Tomorrow night, I'm very excited about our Bible study tomorrow night. We're going to have Alan Compton, Larry Wilson, Derek Pigg, and Terrell Phillips share with us tomorrow night. And I am looking forward to that, as I know you are as well. So we'll pick up with this Christian Evidences study, hopefully, Lord willing, on Thursday night. We look forward to that time together.